Hi, as introduced, I'm Lauren Buck, and this work is on interpersonal affordances and social dynamics in collaborative immersive virtual environments, passing together through apertures. So it's common knowledge that in virtual reality literature, we can assess the fidelity of virtual reality technology by using perceptual and behavioral psychology as tools. Here, we focus on affordances and proxemics to measure the fidelity of virtual reality technology by performing an unplanned task. Specifically, that task is the joint passage of a dyad through an aperture. Affordances are a concept that were introduced by J.J. Gibson, and what they are is that the environment has encoded meanings, and they give us the potential for actions based on bodily metrics. So for example, if I'm going to walk through a doorway, I can either decide to walk through that doorway or not based on my own bodily dimensions. And next, proxemics are defined by Hall, and they are the study of how we manage our personal space boundaries. And so using affordances and proxemics, we performed our own study, and we found that people have different affordance and proxemics behaviors in both the real world and virtual environments. And so first I'm going to go over some literature that's related to our own work, that being affordances, and I don't have much time to go in depth about all of this literature, so I'm just going to pass over something that's critical to our work, and it's something called a critical threshold. And so a critical threshold was defined by Warren, and he said that a critical threshold is basically when one behavior is no longer feasible, and so it's seeded by another behavior. So basically, it relates directly to your bodily dimensions, and when you can't do an action, you're going to do a different action. Proxemics are also another key part of evaluating our work. Proxemics have been evaluated with agents primarily, so here we want to extend this work by evaluating it with human-driven avatars. And next, I'll talk about shared immersive virtual environments, nonverbal communication, and body representation. We're extending all of this work in a collaborative nature with our work. And we asked three basic questions in regard to the current literature on all of this work and our own intuitions about our own research. So we asked the first question, how will behavior change in the virtual environment? The second question, do personal space boundaries hold up in the virtual environment? And the third question, do the gender of the self-avatars affect the affordance judgments, if at all? And so before performing our studies, we did a planning pilot study where we had a dyad walk through a pair of poles, or red PVC poles, that we placed from 0 meters to 3 meters wide apart. And we were hoping to characterize a wide scope of passing behaviors. So on the top left, you'll see the first behavior, which is single file with adjustment. And that behavior happens when one person passes through the poles by themselves and they rotate their shoulders or make bodily adjustments. And then the second behavior, which is top right, is single file. And that behavior happens when one person passes through the poles by themselves but makes no bodily adjustments. And the next behavior is adjustment, which is bottom left. And that behavior is when the dyad passes through the poles simultaneously, but they make bodily adjustments. And finally, the last behavior, which is bottom right, is when the dyad passes through the pair of poles together simultaneously, but they make no bodily adjustments. So we used shoulder width as a metric to determine the critical thresholds. And so what we did is we decided that we could place the poles at 0.15 to 2 times the combined shoulder width to pole width, to where all the dyads would perform all of the behaviors. And so we came up with some hypotheses about our experiment. We have more hypotheses in our paper, but I don't have time to go over all of them. So the first hypothesis that we came about for our first experiment was that the shoulder rotation, which is adjustment in our terminology, would be similar to that of Davis et al. And Davis et al. Did a study where they had a dyad pass through an aperture in the real world, and they found that the critical threshold was smaller for the dyad than it was for a singular person. And so we thought it would be less than what was found by Warren and Wong in 1987 for singular actors. And the next hypothesis that we presented was that we would have a gender difference based on the findings from previous proxemics literature. And so our first experiment was done in the real world, And what we did is we had 24 different dyads walk through a pair of poles together that they viewed as a doorway or an aperture. And so we had 8 male-male pairs, 8 female-female pairs, and 8 male-female pairs. And so all of the dyads passed through various sets of apertures that were a ratio of their combined shoulder width to pole width, and they performed a total of 39 trials. And so I'm not going to talk about the statistics since I don't have time to go into all of them, but the only results that were significant from our first experiment were in the adjustment behavior. We found that male-female dyads tended to adjust at higher critical thresholds than both male-male dyads and female-female dyads. And we also found that our results were consistent with Davis et al., and our critical threshold for adjustment was 0.98, and the average critical threshold adjustment that we found was 0.99. So if you take a look at the graphical representation of our data, we want to focus on the middle column, or the pink points. The x-axis is the pole width over the combined shoulder width, which was our critical ratio, and the y-axis is dyad type. And if you look at all of the pink points in the middle, you'll see that the male-female dyads on top are adjusting at higher critical thresholds than both the male-male and female-female dyads. And this is designated by the letter notation above the points. If the letter is different for a singular point, that means it's significantly different than all of the other points. And so after performing our first experiment, we came up with some hypotheses about our second experiment. And our second experiment was going to be performed in the virtual world. So we thought for our first hypothesis that we would see effects of gender similar to those in the real world. Since people would not know their counterpart, people were placed in a distributed environment, so this is why we thought this. And our second hypothesis was that we would see effects of the underlying gender of the participants, and we would be able to differentiate behaviors across the avatars based on the gender of the participants. And then our third hypothesis was that the critical thresholds would be smaller in the virtual world than they would be in the real world. And so in our second experiment, it was an analog of the first experiment. So we had all of the avatars, or people in the avatars, performing the same task of passing through a pair of poles together, and they performed all of the same behaviors that we were performed in the real world. And so we had 56 participants, or 56 dyads, participating in this study. And the dyad configurations were different for this study since it was done in the virtual world. That doesn't necessarily mean that you could have the same gender that you would have in the real world. So we varied genders across dyads as well. So if you were a male-male person, you could have a male-male avatar, or a male-female avatar, or female-female avatars. And so we were only able to confirm our first hypothesis that we would see an effect of gender in this experiment because the male-female, or male-male and female-female avatars were significantly different in their single file with adjustment and single file performance, but these were different than the behaviors that we found in the real world. And so if you take a look at the graphical representation of our data again, you'll see that all of the points are shifted to the right, and this is the same sort of graphical representation, and the points are shifted to the right because the apertures become wider in the virtual environment for people to believe that they can pass through them. And so if you look at both the left two columns on the right, you can see that the male-male and female-female avatar pairings are different in their behavior. And so we compared experiments 1 and 2 finally. And so in a comparison between these two experiments, we found a main effect of dyad and environment type, and planned comparisons found that between the gender analogs in both environments, the critical thresholds were higher in the virtual environment than they were for the real world. And so to conclude, I'm going to go over our findings from both of our experiments again. In the first experiment, we were able to replicate the previous findings in literature that critical thresholds were lower for dyads than they were for a singular person passing through an aperture. We also found that gender played a role in how the dyads performed, since male-female dyads performed differently than both male-male and female-female dyads. And for our second experiment, we found that gender differences occurred, but they were between different genders with different behaviors. So our first hypothesis for this experiment was only partially confirmed. And then we found that behavioral differences were not driven by the underlying gender of the user. We found no significant results here, so we couldn't confirm that hypothesis. And finally, we couldn't confirm our third hypothesis because the critical thresholds were larger than those that were found in the real world. And we initially thought this was going to be true because we thought that the field of view was so limited and the lack of haptic feedback would cause people to, I guess, navigate closer to one another, but this was not the case. And the findings from this were actually similar to those in collision avoidance literature. And so ultimately, the takeaway from all of this are that behaviors are different in the real and virtual world. So I would like to take a minute to thank our funding sponsor, NSF, and the people who helped work on this project, Richard Paris and Priya Rajan. And thank you for your attention. And if anyone has any questions, I'm open.
Hi, I'm Project from Roskilde University in Denmark. Just a quick clarificatory question. Did you control for body ownership?
Did we control for what?
Body ownership, the avatar.
Body ownership?
Yeah.
So we had people, we told people they would have avatars, and we allowed them to look at their avatars. So I guess if that's what you're asking.
But the quality of, I don't know, the sense of body ownership would probably have, I don't know, some interference with changes in their behavior and the threshold, adjustment threshold.
Yeah, I mean, we did have a questionnaire that we asked people, you know, did you feel like you were in your avatar? Was it real? And people usually responded that they felt that, you know, they owned their body.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Hi, Ross Schwartz from Facebook. Did you have, so for the dyads, did they know each other or they're strangers?
No, they didn't know each other.
And then did you look at any cultural differences?
No,
in
we
kind of
didn't.
like, because Proximus, you know, has like different cultural.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Yeah, our avatars were pretty static, so we used the same too. So, and the subjects were in different rooms, so they never saw each other. I guess we could have asked that question for the real world experiment, but we didn't.
No, but I mean for the participants themselves, their kind of like cultural background.
Yeah, we didn't ask
okay.
anything.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So this is a slightly different topic, but I was wondering if you would have any ideas or suspicions about how you could apply some of these findings to reduce harassment or to control for harassment, proxemic-based harassment in social virtual reality?
That's a good question. I would have to think about that, actually.
Because the thing that strikes me is that if you go into some social VR worlds, like VR chat or something, people go there specifically to have
Harass
kind of
people.
like harass and just cause absolute chaos. I'm just wondering whether if we can kind of learn anything from different types of design in terms of maybe environmental design or avatar design that could be used
I would
to-
assume like you could probably play around with avatars and see how people, treat other people with different, how they appear. And you could, I guess, introduce a set of avatars that people would be less likely to,
One more quick
behave
question.
toward.
In the male-female dyads, you said that they showed avoidance behavior. Was there an asymmetry between which gender avoided more in these cases? Like, was it the male getting out of the way of the female, or the female getting out of the way of the male, or kind of balanced?
I'm pretty sure the male always tended to cede to the female when passing through.
Let's take Lauren again.